Hello and welcome to episode 89 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amolith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Linus.
Good to talk to you all again and welcome to the show, Linus.
Cheers.
So before we get started, Amolith, you wanted to plug something.
Yes, a friend of mine is organizing the Wwise Game Jam. That's WATT-Wise. And the challenge of this particular game jam is building delightful games that use as little energy per second as possible in order to make games and computing more sustainable. Submission is March 22nd through April 22nd, and evaluation is April 23rd through April 28th. And the website is wwise.games, with no dash between Wwise.
Right, well, I'll put a link in the show notes. That sounds really cool. Amolith, last time we talked about collaboration workflows, and you have got something of a correction.
Yes. We had some feedback from the last episode, and I wanted to address it. One of the things that was said probably a few times was that there were actually two issues that we were discussing, and we ended up conflating them. And I do agree with that. I also don't know what I was thinking when I suggested that emailed patches are smaller than PRs, because that's not necessarily the case at all. But I've been thinking about it some more ever since we recorded in early December, I think it was, because I wasn't satisfied with it then, and it wasn't until we got the feedback that I realized why I wasn't satisfied with it. The more I've done direct comparisons, GitHub has done a pretty damn good job of replicating the Git over email experience. The main differences are that one of them is platform specific, and the other one is generic and distributed, and two, you primarily interact with one in a browser and the other in the same environment as your code. So, in my opinion, generic and distributed is always an asset, but the meat of that discussion was primarily about number two. I think interacting with contributions in the same environment as my code is what makes Git over email such a great experience, because there's none of that context switching between your terminal, your editor, and then suddenly your browser with the whole internet full of distractions at your fingertips.
Do most people interact with GitHub via the browser, though? I didn't think they did.
I know there is a GitHub command line tool, and probably a few of them that use GitHub's API, but from my experience, most people interact with the platform's collaboration tooling from the browser, whether that's Forgeo, GitHub, or GitLab.
I work a lot in GitHub, and I do mostly interact as a reviewer with the browser. When the patches are large, I do check them out because then I can navigate them in my regular code editor. And sometimes that helps, and it's a bit easier to spot. Well, if the code is confusing, like I need to really delve into it, then I want to do it in my editor, don't I? But at the same time, I like to practice reviewing code because I'm not good at it. And I feel that sometimes just reading it in the browser and being able to understand it there speaks well of the pull request, I guess, if I don't need to navigate it with my editor. And also, I think it's practice for me, because I'm terrible at reviews, probably because I think it's boring.
So in that situation, you're sort of talking about reviewing the code in patch form versus applied patch form.
Yeah.
In my experience as well, it's been mostly through the browser, although there are various plugins for all the different editors that allow you to interact with GitHub not in the browser. Although I would say most often I've seen people interact with the browser for most items. This may not always be true, though, depending on where you work and the culture of that company and just the culture of the team as well. Each team might have a different workflow that they all kind of congeal on together. While there might be one or two outliers, a lot of people tend, at least on the teams that I've worked on, tend to interact with the code in similar manners because a lot of that is shared understanding, and it also helps with the process as you're going through as a team to look at the various PRs and understand what's going on in the code base and what's happening in the company in general.
There's one that you haven't mentioned, which is a common tool, but it's not really open source oriented. That's Garrett, which I use at my workplace, which does patches very differently. They don't have a separate branch and you request the main branch to merge your topic branch. Instead, it's all in one commit. So every time you edit a patch, you have to do git commit amend, which is what I was first introduced to when I did code review. So I kind of prefer that method. It took some getting used to I don't know what the right way is in GitHub. Some people still do git commit amend constantly, and some just stack the commits on top of each other in the pull request. And I'd say all the good projects then squash all the commits into one before they merge it. I think that the downside of GitLab and GitHub is that they kind of promote editing the commits in the browser, and I think that's terrible. Mostly because it gets me confused. If I edit in the browser, then I forget to sync with my editor branch, and then I just mess it up.
Interesting. So I actually haven't seen that part of it. I've seen people interact with the collaboration pieces in the browser, the comments, commenting on lines of code, all that sort of thing. Maybe just viewing for general review. But I haven't seen too many people use the in-browser editor. Again, mine is a sample size of 1. However, most people I've seen when they want to make an edit to that actual PR, that branch, they then at that point will pull the whole thing out into their editor, make whatever changes they want, make some commits and push them back up.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's a git commit amend or just stacking up all the commits, I think every place that I've worked so far, we've stacked up the commits and then everything is just squashed down into an atomic commit for the actual PR to merge.
Yeah, that's how I prefer to work. I don't really know why. I mean, I guess it's a cool gimmick that you can edit in the browser, but I've seen examples where people will hybrid do that for small changes and then do the bigger change requests in their editor, and you end up in weird places. If they're not comfortable with dealing with conflicts and juggling multiple patches on the same branch from different sources, it can get weird.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I would definitely say if it gets into those scenarios where there's a multitude of commits happening in the browser, off the browser, locally, and things not being synced up properly between all the various remotes, that can definitely get hairy. However, at that point, usually that's when I would tell somebody to pause it and let's go back to some of the underlying principles of what it is that we're trying to do here. And I've most often seen that with some of the more, this might be inflammatory, but I've most often seen that with some of the more sysadmin or DevOps style roles where it's small changes to, a script or something. It's not really a major pull request. You're not refactoring a large section of code. You're not adding a major feature or anything. It's just something small. And then that may lead into something more complex, such as, oh, that change actually means we should re-architect this differently, or there's a better way to do that. And that might lead into something more complex. Although I think in those scenarios, I've most often seen people say, all right, hold on, let's step back for a second. We're going to readdress this more holistically. But again, it's a small sample size.
It's funny you bring up sysadmins, because I think that's the one, well, sysadmin and DevOps is the one profession in our field where sometimes time takes precedence over quality. Like, we need to get this, something's broken, we need to fix it. Just fix it in the editor, push it through and make everything work again, and then address possible quality afterwards.
I would actually say, unfortunately, that's also taking place in the more software engineering style roles as well now, too. Just push that feature out. Just push the bug now. Go.
Yeah.
I think you have just pissed off a lot of sysadmins with that comment, Linus.
I think that's sometimes what's exhilarating about that work, that things do go tits up and you have to think on your toes.
I do sometimes enjoy the adrenaline from the panic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an action job.
I don't know if that's panic or if that's just the fourth monster at 3 a.m, but either way.
Well, when the websites for the shows are down and I have to get them back up, I do not enjoy that panic. Nothing about it is good.
It's even worse when you have someone standing over your shoulder waiting for you to type out the magic fix. That's the worst for me. I feel like I lose all ability to type, all ability to think. I turn into just a frozen statue who can barely remember what my name is.
I'm glad I've never been in that position.
I think it's even worse when you're the boss and it's like you've got no one to blame but yourself.
I prefer that, because if I'm the one to blame, I can get it fixed, usually, rather than having to rely on other people to get it fixed.
Yeah, at least I have access to everything.
If you're the boss, you're the one blaming yourself instead of another boss blaming you. Mm-hmm. I guess the first option I'd take.
Well, I suppose in my case, it's the thousands of bosses that I have out there listening who are hassling me. Why is the website down?
I think everyone always has a boss to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxdevtime.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Linux Dev Time is part of the Late Night Linux family, which means that for $10 a month on Patreon, you can get access to an RSS feed that contains all the Late Night Linux family shows without adverts like this. There's also an option to get just this show ad-free for $5 a month. Some of the episodes are even released a day or so early for Patreon supporters. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it'd be great if you could support us at linuxdevtime.com/support.
During the last episode, Joe asked something along the lines of, if SourceHut or email didn't exist, would you use GitHub? And I realized that the platform doesn't actually matter a ton to me. What matters more to me is integration with my editor. As long as I don't have to do that mental context switch from working, editing, typing to reviewing code and other stuff in a browser, I think I'd be pretty happy using any platform. But then that gets back to point A from earlier on, open and distributed versus closed and platform specific. I'll always prefer the thing that's more open, I think.
So how strongly then would you also stick with that at a particular company? If a company has a setup that they mandate for their team, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that they are on GitHub, as many companies are, and primarily the team is a standard run-of-the-mill, maybe using VS Code, and they interact with most of their code reviews in browser. How would you approach that team? Would this be like a non-starter, or would you then try to get people to see your way and use your tools and plugins? Like, how important is that to you picking a team to work on?
When it comes to working with people, if they're already established, I'll use whatever they use. That's why I've used GitLab pretty extensively and GitHub a little bit more somewhat recently in the last few months. And if I notice serious deficiencies or places I think could use improvement, then I'll suggest improvements within the ecosystem they're already using. I don't want to suggest the whole team, 5, 10, whatever people, switch wholesale to using an email client in a terminal. That's a huge barrier for entry and a massive pain in the ass. And I recognize that.
Is that something that you've looked at as well for the different jobs that you've taken? What is the team set up and what are they currently using during, let's say, the interview or, process before accepting a job?
I have asked about it, but I haven't put a whole lot of weight on that particular answer.
Yeah, no, because I listened to the last episode, and I understand you use a terminal-based email client. Is it Mutt or is it another one? Because I'm not aware of any alternatives. I only know about Mutt.
The one I use is MU4E within Emacs, but in terms of those within a terminal, there's Mutt, there's NeoMutt, Arc, spelled AERC by Drew DeVault, and also one called, I think, Alpine, another called Himalaya. There are a bunch of options.
The only experience I have with this is from the Linux canal source, and when you set that up, they're like, you do Mutt, and this is how you do it. They, however, don't put any emphasis on how you choose to edit the code. The emphasis is how you submit it. And I recall this kind of changed for me around 2012, I guess. My first employer, they were like, everybody has to use Eclipse because that's how we have the project set up. So everybody use Eclipse. And I was fresh out of uni, so I was fine with that. I had to get Vim bindings on Eclipse, which took a while, but I worked through it. But that kind of disappeared now. There's very little. Everybody uses VS Code now. It feels like most people use VS Code. But the demand from employers or teams on what you use has kind of disappeared, and it's just the shape of what you submit, which is important, which is really refreshing that this is no longer an issue.
So you two have been in development for a very long time, and I'm sure you've moved through various workflows, either mandated or voluntary of your own volition. What is one concept or paradigm that if that approach suddenly didn't exist, your preferred workflow would be majorly impacted? So I'll give you an example of what I mean, because I know I didn't word it very well. Automatic window management is something I would really not want to do without, because stacking window managers like XFCE, LXQT, all that stuff, there's always some amount of cognitive load for arranging my windows because I like my desktop looking clean, organized, minimal, one application full screen so I can focus on what I'm doing and nothing else. So the options are either waste time arranging all my windows or just deal with everything looking cluttered and scattered. And I don't like either of those. So some sort of automatic window management solves that for me. And if it were to disappear, I wouldn't be very happy.
That was a very long way to say I use Arch and i3, by the way.
You could be using Awesome.
I could be. I could also be on Ubuntu. But anyway, do either of you have workflow components like that?
So before I get to mine, I actually feel very similar about automatic window management. Tiling, I think you tried pretty hard not to say tiling, or I'm going to say tiling. I very much enjoy tiling. I could do without it. I don't want to do without it, but I could. And when forced to use a Mac at a previous job, I just ended up learning tmux way better, and my terminal became my new window manager. So at that point, I just bent around the rules. Now, for my actual answer, I would say the one, I don't know if it's a paradigm, it's not an actual tool, but version control in general. I've been at companies before that either lacked version control at all or were very, very poor at it. And it was very painful to work there. And even introducing version control, it's one of those things that's not easy to pick up from zero. To go from 0 to 1 is very difficult. And then to go from 1 to above can still be difficult, but at least you're on the train and you're rolling. That's one thing I would not want to do without, primarily because it allows you to do a few things, not just save previous versions and kind of iterate through the software, but it'll also allow you to do things like look back at the code 6 months from now and say, who changed this one section? Git blame. That's pretty powerful when you're working on a team, especially if a team where you may not know everybody or you may be new to a code base or what have you. Being able to look back at the code and see who changed it and any sort of minuscule amount of context or evidence as to why that code changed is amazing. Additionally, it allows you to stop checking in or saving a bunch of commented out code that you don't actually need and isn't actually running. You can just delete it and go back and look at a previous revision if you need to pull it back up from the grave. So version control is the one thing that I really would not want to have to do without if I had to pick one thing.
I was really struggling to think of something, but then you just breezed by tmux, and I'd say a terminal multiplexer. I've gone through a few, but I've been on tmux for a very long time now. Yeah, that's where I do all my window management, because I don't really care what window manager I do use, because I realize now I only use 2 windows. I use the terminal, and then I use a browser, and then I have a bunch of tabs in the terminal, and that's where I live. So yeah, tmux would really kill me. Yeah, the code I work with now, I can get around with documentation via man files, so I rarely need the browser for that. So yeah, no, tmux, definitely.
I think I have an alibi as well. There's one thing that I could do without, and I would say actually most of us probably do without in general anyways, but that's a actual code review from someone other than yourself. Having been in places where you are the only person to look at the code, check it in, and maybe it goes through CI or CI/CD pipeline or not. But having someone else look at your code and give it an actual review, while painful for the reviewer sometimes, and sometimes even painful for the reviewee, if it's nitpicky or if they're going into too many minute details, but it can also produce far better code. I think the toughest code reviews I've been through are the ones where the reviewer has been very harsh on code that I've submitted, and the code always comes out better in the other end, to the point where I've been like, that was somewhat painful at the time, but I'm very glad I went through that. And I'm currently at a company where code reviews are wishy-washy, to say the least. And that's something I actually do miss a lot, is having someone else look at my code with a very critical eye and go through it, not just looking for missed semicolons and things, but to actually go through it architecturally and say, hey, there's a better way to do this, or have you thought about coming at it from this other angle? That's pretty huge.
Yeah, for sure. I have controversial opinions about code review, but all the values you just brought up, I can definitely see. Maybe I've just had bad experiences with code review, both as a reviewer and as a reviewee, I guess.
Oh, I've definitely had bad experiences on both sides of the review. I just think when done well and when mandated well, and this, it takes a little bit of cultivating from, I think, the leaders in the team, but when done well, it should be the exception that there's a bad code review on either side. And the code should come out better. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is to write better software.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Thanks a lot for joining us, Linus. It's been great having you.
Oh, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amolith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Linus.
See you later.